Good evening. Whoa, I didn't test this yet. Could everyone kind of come in from outside and have a seat? We're going to get started. I know we're a little behind, but we want to be mindful of your time, and thank you for being here this evening. So thank you for coming this evening. This is a meeting that's hosted by our Long Range Planning Committee to get some public input on the approach that the committee is taking for rezoning rural Windham. I'm Amanda Lassard. I'm the planning director. I'm going to take a few minutes just to introduce. There's members of the Long Range Planning Committee here. If you're in the audience and just kind of want to take a moment and say hi, you'll see them later as we move on to some facilitated discussion after this presentation. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the background and how we got here and what the purpose of this meeting is. Then Ben Smith from North Star Planning. He is the town's former planning director who is now consulting and assisting the committee with this effort. We'll talk about the approach to rural zoning. Then we'll come back and talk about what the next steps are. We won't be reconvening after the facilitated discussion, so we want to just give you an overview of kind of what's going to happen after this meeting. Then we'll have some breakout groups that will be facilitated by staff and members of the Long Range Planning Committee. So the committee was tasked by the town council. Well, first of all, the committee was created by the town council as principally responsible for implementing elements of the comprehensive plan that was adopted in June 2017. Last fall, really last summer, there have been lots of discussion around town about the amount of growth that we've been happening, the amount of concern of the subdivision applications development that's been happening in rural parts of Windham. So the council charged the committee with looking at the zoning of the rural parts of Windham, which is, for our purposes, is the current farm and farm residential zoning districts. So we use zoning as a tool to potentially reduce the overall development in rural Windham by regulating lot sizes, frontage requirements, and ultimately that will tell the number of lots in a given area. This is not necessarily limiting the growth over time. It's not the number of new lots in a given year. That would be a separate kind of effort. So we'll use these zoning tools to shape future development, to blend with some existing landscapes. So we'll be preserving rural function and rural character. So some background and context. We recognize that Windham is rural Windham's a finite resource. This is a picture from looking south on Route 202, just as you cross over from Gray. On the left is, in 2002, a hayfield, and you see this piece of equipment there. The same Google Street View from 2018 shows a few houses here and there, and that's kind of been the trend. This area of Sweat Road and Chute Road in 2018 had 28 new homes just since 2006. So part of balancing this effort between growth in rural Windham is also giving some priorities to these rural areas and making sure that we don't lose these and protecting these resources. So we showed this slide in November. We had 2 public forums to kind of kick off this project. We talked about what the trends have been, what the implications of growth are, and got some public input, and it's kind of set the stage for the committee to look at this approach to how we'll be rezoning. So this has been the trend of growth over the last 30 years in Windham. The trend is pretty clear under current zoning. This, again, was November, so the last year that you're seeing here for 2018 was a little higher. I think we ended the year at 116 new dwelling units. And this year to date, we're on track to probably match that number. But the trend is clear under current zoning that this would continue. And we made some population projections in our comp plan process that, based on this trend, this might equate over time by 2030 that there would be 1,400 new dwelling units that would need to be put somewhere in town. So the question is, this pile of dots that's on the left, where are they going to go? We have some say with our zoning regulations on where they'll be on the map. And the farm and farm residential zoning districts are 65% of town. So that's a large area. So the purpose of zoning then is really the rules that people have to follow for development. It addresses what's allowed, meaning what kind of uses can occur in a certain district. And those districts are where we are in town. There's a zoning map. We also address how and how much. So what are the standards for the amount of units, the amount of dwelling units that occur, and what the standards are for how they are placed on the land. So these are standards that apply to all development, whether you're in a subdivision or not. So this is what the committee has been spending some time talking about since we got some public input in November. And so Ben's going to come up here and give a little recap on that recent planning effort.
Thank you. So I'm Ben Smith, North Star Planning, former planning director, as Amanda said, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach to this problem of growth in rural Windham. It's been posed as a problem. It's been a long-term trend. It's something that needs to get reacted to. But before we get into the details of it, I was wondering how many people in the room know what zoning district they live in? That's definitely higher than average based on, I think, the topic for this meeting. You know, almost everyone knows. Raise your hand if you think Maine's a rural state. Almost everyone. Is Cumberland County rural? Yeah, it's not clear cut. Some parts are and some parts aren't. Raise your hand if you live on a property that's 4 acres or less. That's a good number, maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the room. More than 4 acres? Handful. How about more than 10 acres? A dozen or so. Any 40 acres or more? 3, 4. So some of the things that the committee's taken as assumptions, these are the things that we've kind of taken for granted as we go into a process like this, is that Windham is changing, Windham is growing. This is something that's very clear based on those numbers and based on the trends that Amanda just showed. It will continue to change and it will continue to grow. And I think that the real question for the community is, how will that growth take place, where will it take place, and how much will be allowed in certain areas. So this growth is not new. That chart that Amanda had up was very strong growth to some of the highest growth rates in the state over the last 40 years in Windham. So it's not new, but the effects are cumulative and they're permanent. So what I mean by that is, I think last November I gave the example of, you know, when you get into an elevator and you're the only one on the elevator, and then at the next floor 2 or 3 people get on and it's still not crowded, and the next floor 2 or 3 more people get on, and then it's not really crowded, but when one more person gets on, it feels very crowded. And I think that is some of what of the effect that people are seeing, and they're really starting to feel. It's in people's homes, it's where they live, and it's very real. As Amanda mentioned, this is an offshoot. This is really one of the very first things that the council has asked the Long Range Planning Committee to address coming out of a comprehensive planning process. And as a rural area, the definition of a rural area in the comprehensive planning process is a place to protect from development. It's a place to disincentivize or limit growth. The opposite of a rural area is a growth area in the comprehensive plan. So what we're talking about this evening and what we've been talking about for several months and will continue as we go forward is really the rural parts of Windham, the places we want to minimize growth and protect from development. But the important asterisk to that is growth management. The kinds of things we're talking about is not no growth. This is how growth happens and how much. So last September, the Long Range Planning Committee gave a presentation to the town council where they talked about some of the different ways you could approach growth in rural Windham. There's a number of different things you could do. This is not a complete list, but it's a good start of a list. And the top two that are highlighted up here have to do with looking at how subdivision development takes place and looking at zoning for all of rural Windham. So right now, the town council has some proposals, and they've actually gone to the planning board, I believe, to look at how subdivision development takes place in rural Windham. And what we're talking about this evening is broader than that. This is any development, whether you're in a subdivision or not, whether you're splitting a lot off or doing 20 or 30 lots all at once. So the implications of this growth, there's a number of them. When we had our public meetings, that Amanda said, there were 2 public meetings in November, and what we heard most clearly from people was loss of open space and rural character is the number one issue of growth in Windham. And followed closely behind that is environmental concerns and loss of habitat for wildlife. So that certainly shapes an approach to redoing zoning. If we had gone into this looking at traffic as the main concern, we might have come up with a different approach. But looking at open space, rural character, and habitat, we'll talk about what that means. So again, this is a repeat of a slide based on what we heard from the council and based on what we heard from the public last November. We're really consciously looking at reducing overall development potential in rural Windham. And we'll talk about what that means in a couple minutes. But we are also looking to use zoning to shape future development so that in some places that's going to mean preserving rural function, like keeping wildlife habitats intact, aquifer recharge areas. It's also going to mean protecting rural character, and we'll talk about kind of the difference of that for other places. So as you think about Windham, just like when I asked that question a few minutes ago about is Cumberland County rural, and everyone was kind of said kind of. I think if you think even at a lower level, thinking about Windham specifically, there are rural landscapes in town and there are suburban landscapes in town. And the difference is that rural landscapes are really focused on production. They are working lands. They are focused on production from the land, things like forestry, agriculture, mineral extraction. They are also interspersed with relatively large expanses of natural areas. They're not working lands. They're undisturbed, undeveloped natural areas. They're also characterized by very low residential density. Sometimes rural areas have high seasonal home ownership, and if you think of lake homes or ski houses, those kinds of seasonal things, those are often in rural areas. But that's really the framework of the definition of a rural landscape that the Long Range Planning Committee has had in mind. A suburban landscape is more focused on land development. It's primarily used for single-family homes and low-density neighborhoods. Undeveloped land is not necessarily serving natural functions or wildlife habitat. It is viewed as an asset for existing residents for scenic, historic, recreational purposes. It's not a source of income or livelihood the way it is in a rural area. Windham has a mix of these kinds of landscapes. So here's a couple archetypical pictures. Neither one of these is from Windham, but rural landscapes focused on production. These are agricultural fields, very low residential density, some natural areas interspersed throughout. This looks like a woodlot, as opposed to a suburban landscape, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, roadway networks, relatively higher residential densities. So again, kind of thinking about what is rural. This is an illustration that kind of goes from the left-hand side of the natural areas I mentioned earlier, all the way over to very built-up urban core. So that, you might think of that as downtown Portland or downtown Boston. So when we think about rural and rural Windham, it's over on this side. It's really these three kind of areas: natural areas, rural areas, and suburban areas. So again, there are some very notable natural areas within Windham, and those we heard from people at the November forums are primarily in southern Windham, and we have some maps that'll talk a little bit about that, and they're primarily in eastern Windham. There are also, in addition to what we heard from people at those meetings, there's some maps at the back of the room that show unfragmented blocks of habitat. There's some maps that were part of the comprehensive planning process provided by the state that you can take a look at, and they will show generally larger unbroken habitat blocks. Those are the natural areas. The rural zone, again, is characterized by rural uses. This is where you're going to find sawmills, kennels, things that are generally best suited to not be near higher densities of people and neighborhoods. There are homes in rural areas, and that is something that should continue to be expected, and they're not all farmhouses. They're people who either live in town or live in town and work in town or go to job centers in the Portland area. The suburban zone, and there are many examples of this in town, in the rural areas, as defined by the farm residential today, where the focus is really on quiet country living, being able to have a backyard and some space and listen to the peepers at night and not hear interstates and airports and those kinds of things. So all of these areas are attractive places for people to live, and I think that's why this town has seen a lot of development pressure in these kinds of areas. So as we think about these three areas in particular, there is some tension and there is some conflict, and you know, new development, higher density development, even if it's not very high, it could be higher than what's there today, has an impact on the people who are there today, and it has an impact on the businesses that are in rural Windham today. There's also some tension the other way, in the fact that these new homes are resulting in a loss of open space, a loss of rural character. But all of that development, whether it's in, you want to call it a rural or a suburban setting, it all has an impact on those more natural areas where you find some of those natural functions taking place. So as we think a little bit more about this. Now we're going to start to get into the more technical zoning implications of this, is that Amanda had provided that overview of it's what's allowed, it's where it's allowed, and how it happens. This is a use table that talks about what's allowed, and I know nobody can read that from where you are. I can hardly read it from here. But the idea that we wanted to point out was, if you look at these uses, this first column is what's allowed in the farm zone, and it's all permitted uses or conditional uses, which means it's allowed as long as it meets certain conditions. So all of these uses are allowed in the farm zone. All of the same uses are allowed in the farm residential zone, with a couple notable exceptions. And again, maybe by show of hands, as you drive around town, can you tell when you go from the farm zone to the farm residential zone? Just raise your hand if you can tell. Some people can tell. What we've talked about is a greater differentiation. So in the future development would be shaped by a greater differentiation between things that would be appropriate to a place that is more focused on rural uses and a place that is more focused on rural residential. So the focus, this is all under a rural umbrella, but one is clearly more tolerant and more allowing of residential development. And then there are a couple, one new use, and we'll talk about that at the facilitated tables. And the next part of this has to do with where is rural Windham. And if folks were at that meeting, or one of those meetings we had back in December, there was a mapping exercise, and we did take that feedback. So today, there's a farm zone and there's a farm residential zone, and our mandate, our task, was to look at zoning within these areas. So again, there will be some more detailed information, larger copies of this that you can get your hands on and take home. But everything in green or yellow over here is in the rural area. And as Amanda said, that's a very large, vast majority of town is designated as rural. So as we think about this, we tried to figure out what parts of Windham today do serve those rural functions. And as people told us in November, those are primarily going to be located in southern Windham, between 302 and this is 302 and this is 202. So this kind of quadrant of town, and this eastern quadrant of town, kind of east of 302 and 202. Those are the parts of town that have the larger properties. They are less developed than other parts of the community. And the yellow areas are more characterized by neighborhood type development. So we'll be asking for some feedback on those. The rural areas, again, with an eye toward that definition of what is rural, very low numbers of new homes, and rural residential where you have slightly higher new homes, but the objective would be to protect that residential development from intrusive nuisance uses that we've heard about over the last year or so, with mineral extraction in close proximity to what is now neighborhoods. So we've talked about uses and we've talked about where things are located, and the next piece of this was how development happens, how it's shaped and regulated. And there's really two pieces to this. The first is density and the second is lot size. And today, it's all about lot size. Lot size is density, and that's how it's regulated today in Windham. But they're really two different things. Density is units per area, and lot size is area per dwelling unit. And it seems like a difference without a distinction, but as you get into it, they really are significantly different. Examples of this might be fish per mile of stream. In a more municipal context, it's municipal valuation or jobs or amount of crime per acre. You can measure those things on a area basis. And what we've been focused on is the number of dwellings per unit of land. So a relatively high residential density would be 10 to 15 dwellings per acre. That's about what you'd need for a fixed route bus service, for example. And there's no one who's proposing that for rural Windham. A relatively low residential density might be looking at 1 dwelling per 5 acres. And if you want to keep it all on an acre basis, that's 0.2 dwellings per acre. That's density. Those are examples of how you think and look at density. Lot size is based on the area per dwelling unit. So there is an example in Auburn where they have an agricultural and resource protection zone, 10 acres per dwelling. And they do say in their zoning ordinance that that is also the density. So you need to have at least 10 acres to put a new home if you're in that zoning district in Auburn. Today in Windham, as I mentioned, we look at things through the lens of lot size, and the lot size in the farm zone is 80,000 square feet per dwelling. That's 1.8 acres per dwelling, and farm residential is 50,000 square feet per dwelling, and it's about 1.2. So density, again, is units per area. And in this example, it's 50 beans per table. And in this example, it's 200 beans per table. So as you kind of continue through some of these examples, it doesn't matter how you arrange them, it's still 200 beans per table. And this is really one of the challenges, I think, that people are starting to see the results of in Windham when you look at things only through one lens, is that you're not necessarily getting the design. There's a wide range of design that all meets this density standard, but they're all clearly different. So today, we look at things, look at a piece of property, whether you are a property owner or a developer interested in acquiring some property. You take the property size, divide by the minimum lot size for whatever zoning district you're in, and that tells you how many houses you could put on that property. If you were looking to maximize that number of lots per property, that's the equation, that's the math. Net residential density does not factor into it today. Increasing the minimum lot size, and this is something we've heard from several people throughout the process, is only going to eat up rural land faster. Meaning if Windham is building 100 houses per year and 60 of those are in the rural area, today 60 times 2 acres is 120 acres, and if you change it to 5, it's going to be happening twice as quickly. So we, in the Long Range Planning Committee, have talked about how to use lot size with density, kind of split those out so that you're looking at a maximum net residential density and a maximum lot size as a way to potentially get some better control over how development and how much development occurs. So maximum net residential density is where you look at the property size divided by the net residential density to get the number of lots, but if you look at the maximum lot size, that is a limit on the size of new lots. So in this case, we have a minimum lot size today of 80,000 square feet. That's 1.8 acres about. If you have a maximum lot size of 1.8 acres, that's as big as a new lot could be. If you have a maximum lot size of 5 acres, that's as big as a new lot could be. The idea is that that would allow for the preservation of keeping intact that larger piece of land that the lot would be coming from. And that would get at some of the ecological, rural functions and potentially rural character issues that we heard about in November. And then the minimum lot size would still be in place to make sure that septics and wells can be located on new lots and safely interact with neighbors. So some of this may look familiar to folks who were at the November meeting, but for easy math, here's a 20-acre property. And today, this is kind of the status quo for development in the farm zone, where you're looking at about 2 acres, minimum lot size of 2 acres. You can get 10 homes on that 20-acre property. If you split net residential density out from lot size and you leave that density at 2 acres per home, you can, in this example of 1 acre lot size, have about 10 acres associated with that original house that would still be, in this case it's a field that is used for agriculture, but it could be forested land or otherwise remain productive land in the rural zone. If you change the minimum lot size to 5 acres, that on a 20-acre piece, that again, relatively simple math, would give you 4 dwelling units on that 20-acre piece. And again, if you change the net residential density again to 1 acre in this example, it might be something else, but in this example, you'd still have those 4 homes. The net result in this example is same amount of development rights. They would just be configured in a different pattern. And this is the example of a 10-acre minimum lot size. You could get 2 dwelling units on a 20-acre piece. So the big question that we really don't have an answer for yet, that's part of what this meeting is for, and some of the next phase of the work is going to be figuring out what is the right rural density for Windham. The average farm size in Maine in 2017 was 172 acres. In southern Maine, it's much less than that. And overall, the number of farms under 100 acres is about 63% of that 172. So, and again, it would skew smaller in southern Maine. A small commercial woodlot, to be sustainable and have a regular harvest. And maybe folks have got some additional insight on this, but the source we checked, it said, you really should be looking at a woodlot for commercial purposes of 50 to 100 acres. Anything less than that, it is not as economically feasible to have a regular harvest on that property. Habitat blocks, and again, there's some maps in the back that talk about this, but the state goal is to have a series of interconnected blocks of 500 acres in southern Maine. Up in northern Maine, it's higher. I think they're into the thousands of acres. But in southern Maine, where development is heavier, still maintaining habitat for seeing deer, and occasional moose, bear habitat, you're looking at having a series of interconnected 500-acre blocks. They all don't have to be contiguous, but there have to be ways for the animals to move between those habitat blocks. And then when you look at Windham, in the farm and farm residential zone, there's a lot of properties that are under 4 acres today, out of almost 6,000 properties there, and I'll estimate, use round numbers, out of almost 6,000 properties, there's a lot of small lots. The majority of lots are smaller, but those lots only represent 6,000 out of the 26,000 acres in the farm and farm residential zone. There's a number of properties, and it doesn't look big, 452 out of, it's like 10%, less than 10%, but it is the majority of acreage is in properties that are 10 acres or more. So that being said, on a whole, on a state level, Windham isn't really rural by Maine standards, but in the context of Cumberland County or the Portland area, I think there certainly are areas that are rural. So what we looked at are a couple options. If we were to keep this within that state context, if you wanted some parts of town to be rural, meaning working lands, productive lands, low residential densities, based on some of those things, you would need to have a relatively high amount of acres per dwelling unit. The density would be 10 acres and up per dwelling unit. In a rural residential situation, it would be certainly less than that, but it would be much more than it is today. Again, nowhere in the rural parts of town is the minimum lot size over 2 acres. So if you look at it in the context of the region, you still would be looking at a larger amount of land per dwelling unit. And again, depending on how much of the community and where this takes place, thinking about rural functions, thinking about the things that we heard in November, we should be looking at more land per dwelling unit in the rural parts of Windham to counteract the trends that have been very clear and ongoing. So in either option, the recommendation from the committee is to look at a maximum lot size as part of this and keeping that maximum lot size as small as possible to preserve those larger blocks of land. So Amanda's given me the signal to just keep rolling here with the Long Range Planning Committee's next steps. Our plan is over the next 6 weeks or so, next couple months, to take some of the things we hear this evening, take some feedback from the community, refine these numbers a little bit, think about the approach, and get that ready for a town council discussion, which would be scheduled, at their discretion. I think there's a summer schedule happening, so there's not as many meetings, but I think that the Long Range Planning Committee's schedule would jive with more regular meetings coming back on toward the end of the summer. And then the official review process would kick off at that point, where the planning board would have their discussion in a hearing and the council would have their discussion in a hearing. So, this is an approach that we would like to run by the community at this point. It's not fully baked yet, but I think we're probably 3/4 of the way toward that, and we want to make sure that what we finalize and present to the town council so that they have a good starting place for the discussion would get wrapped up in the next couple months. So we will be going into some facilitated discussions in a couple minutes, but I wanted to just see if there were maybe just a couple quick questions. There will be opportunities for questions in the back. I'll kind of be hanging around up front if people have questions. I see a question in the back. This is being recorded. It's on Facebook and it's on going to be up on the town website. So we have a microphone to make sure that gets picked up.
Huh? Yeah, I know. I'll save the trip.
Yeah, the one paper that you can't read that showed half of our rights we're losing on our property. Is there any way we could get a copy we could read instead of a bunch of pictures of beans?
Yep, there are going to be handouts in the back of the room that you can take home. There are going to be materials posted on the website, I believe. And again, this overview was providing kind of a overview of that framework. The hands-on things that we'd like to have folks take a look at and give us some feedback on are going to be at the back of the room, where we've got 3 stations set up, and they're going to be each one of those questions. The where does development happen, what kinds of use, and how much are at each of those tables. The handouts are meant to be written on. They're meant to be commented on and circled and marked up. And you can leave those with us before you leave, or you can take them home and think about things a little more. and then drop them off at the planning office over the next couple of weeks. So before we get too much more into that, I think there were another couple of questions. We're going to start in the back of the room, and I think, depending on how much you want to bounce around, go ahead.
Why is there such a need for development? Where did all this growth idea come from? I mean, the people said at the different meetings they didn't want a lot of growth. So who's in charge of saying we have to have all this growth?
Windham is part of a regional housing market. It's part of a regional job market. And the biggest part of this effort, I think, is trying to find a balance between people who own property and have property rights, balancing that with the needs of the community and the desires of the community and the community character aspects of this. There are very legitimate concerns that we heard in November, and I think most of the voices we heard in November were about rural character. It was about preservation of habitat, keeping water clean, making sure the aquifers are protected. But that's happening within a growing Portland area. And I think that we need to be very thoughtful and very respectful of how the conversation develops, because this is a community conversation about a whole bunch, a collection of private properties.
One of the items listed at the beginning of the discussion was permit limits, permit caps, and you can slow the growth that way. You can't eliminate it, but you can put it at a level that is tolerable for the community, and other communities around us have done that. And it seems to me that would be one way to approach it, and maybe in concert with some of the recommendations that you have.
Yeah.
And the second question that I have is, are you considering redrawing the zones as they are today? Because these zones have been around for a long time, and with the growth that Windham has already seen, just relabeling them and changing some of the conditions of what we already have isn't necessarily going to address the changing community that we have.
Yeah, so there's a couple points there. I think that the first one was illustrated on a previous slide, where you had a whole menu, a whole list of potential interventions that had to do with how a community, how a town can approach the challenges of rapid rural growth. And only one of them was zoning, right? The two that the council said were the most important to tackle first had to do with zoning, but it also had to do with how subdivisions were built. And in particular, those were cluster subdivisions in the farm and farm residential zone. So again, it has to do with how much growth happens and how that growth happens. And those were the two questions with that. And then to your point about actual hard limits to growth caps, those are used in other communities. That is on the table. It may be discussed in the future, but it's beyond the work that the committee's been looking at so far.
Map? His question about redrawing the boundaries.
Yes, so I guess there was a third part to it.
Yeah.
The maps that you'll be able to look at and take home have kept the overall boundary of the farm and farm residential. So when you look at that, the overall boundary is the same, but there has been some adjustment between the lower intensity and the higher intensity flavors of rural zoning. So you'll have a chance to take a look at where some of those have taken place.
Does it really matter what we want? Because having these meetings, you guys are going to make the ultimate decision, and then you're going to bring it to us and tell us this is what we're up against.
The council's going to make the ultimate decision. I think where they start the conversation is important. And I think where they start the conversation is going to depend in part on what we hear this evening. It's going to depend on what we heard in November and in September. But we wanted to bring a couple options for people to react to. So if you think about that alternative one, which is kind of a state context of rural, I know the committee members will be very interested in hearing people's reactions to that versus a more local and more Cumberland County focused definition of rural. Ultimately, I don't know what the council would do, but I think where they start that conversation does matter.
How do you intend to protect personal property rights? What we're talking about here are a lot of people's properties. Those 10 acres, those 20 acres. I think most of the people that own that amount of land also have concerns about the issues that you're bringing up. But they want to have decision-making power over their own land. So I think there are a lot of people who have those 2 acres, 4 acres, and they feel that they somehow have the right over the land that the larger landowners own and also pay taxes on. We really have to deal with that issue. I personally would propose. Okay, I can stop there.
Well, thank you for your comment. That really is the balancing act, I think. There were a couple others in front.
I just had a question. You said the state was interested in having areas in southern Maine have like 500-acre blocks for wildlife that are kept undeveloped. Are they willing to give grants, or how have we pursued finding ways to keep those blocks undeveloped?
There are a number of ways to do that. The state has a number of programs for land conservation. Many communities have programs for land conservation. You don't keep 500 acres or 200 acres or 2,000 acres undeveloped through zoning. There are other mechanisms to do that. So I think that was mentioned as, part of the question of what is rural? When we talk about rural Windham, what are we talking about? And I think in southern Maine and in Windham, there needs to be some of those larger land blocks in order to keep some of those rural functions. And if you don't have them, you lose something. But zoning is not going to be the answer to keeping all of the remaining 500 blocks.
Talking about zoning, that's it, not
There's
or finding ways to keep our land undeveloped.
Yeah, I mean, we talked in September at a very high level with the council about each one of those things on the list, and I think there may have even been a couple other things that couldn't fit on the PowerPoint slide. But the marching orders, the direction we went with and dove deeper into had to do with subdivisions in rural Windham, which is now being discussed at the planning board level, and zoning. So I think that there's a number of other things like growth caps that seem to be generating some conversation in town. I know that the town's also been kicking around the idea, and actually maybe more than that, planning for an open space plan that could help inform partnerships and acquisitions of development rights and open spaces. That would be not zoning.
But if we don't do that soon, there won't be any.
Right, so the comment was if you don't do it soon, you're losing things. And I think that is what we've been hearing throughout this process is, again, going back to those trends, Windham is a very different town today than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And 20 years from now, it's going to be more different. So I think it's going to be a question of what can the community do to help shape and channel some of that growth. And I think we got time for one more, or a couple more. One more? Okay.
The speaker before me elaborated a little bit, but I'm very concerned about 7 people in the community for our town councilors making decisions on landowner rights. That's got me pretty well disturbed. We have processes in Black Brook Preserve, buying land. That's worked very, very well. I think it's a very positive approach to these types of things. But you have, I don't even know how many hundreds or even into the thousands, landowners out there with various acres of land that when they bought their land, they knew what they could do with it. And now we're having this discussion, and I followed a little bit through the written media and stuff last November and stuff. I didn't really have time to pay attention to it too in depth. But it's got to be a collaborative of people in a certain area that want to control what that particular area do with the same mindset. Not so much go into it with somebody driving something down their mind, tell them that, I own 200 acres, 100 acres, all of a sudden 7 people, and I know how this community can be of, if you look in the room, the population of this community, how many people show up for something that's either being impacted or not, and if they're not being impacted, not here.
Yeah.
So you have a very small population of a big open area here that's being decided by very few people. Just because that's what those 7 believe in by some of the input of a very minute community that's this having an effect.
That's a fair point that should be part of the comments.
So this got to be watched very carefully.
Was there one more?
Thank you, Ben. One of the concerns I have, it sounds like the Long Range Planning Committee has been put in a box in terms of looking only at zoning or land use. I know the state has regulations on taxes and fair market value, but I would like to suggest that the town needs to look at incentives for those of us who own tracts of land and want to keep the open space. Instead of putting restrictions on us, I would like to ask that the town look at incentives for keeping those places open space.
That's a fair point. And I know you're probably talking about the current use tax programs that the town does participate in. There is a voluntary municipal farm support program, which does allow the town to adjust tax rates for working farmlands. So there are incentives as well. Yeah.
Hi, quick question. So right now there's different minimum lot sizes for single-family residential dwellings and subdivisions. Are you proposing having the same densities and maximum lot sizes for everything in these zones?
There are 2 minimum lot sizes in rural Windham today. They're for 80,000 square feet for the farm zone and 50,000 square feet for the farm residential zone. And I think you might be talking about the cluster or conservation subdivision approach, which would allow smaller lots in exchange for keeping those larger pieces of land open and preserved. That's an incentive program. When development happens, as opposed to an incentive program to delay or prevent development. The answer is we have looked at those, and those are in front of the planning board. Those conservation subdivision standards are proposed to be updated, and I think if we want to take that part of the conversation, Amanda could answer questions about that. But what I'd like to do at this point is give people a chance to get to the back of the room, grab some of those handouts, and provide us with some written comments on the handouts. Again, you can drop those off and consider yourselves adjourned after you've had a chance to do that. You can grab those, take them home, and bring them back to the planning board with some comments if you'd like some time to think about things or digest the information a little more. So the idea is we're going to be around until about 8:30, and we're going to give people a chance to kind of mingle around in the back. The original idea is that we'd have timed stations, but I think we can manage just people walking around at their own pace. And I will hang out up front for a few minutes. Amanda's going to be walking around. But there are a couple other questions that I'd like people to think about as you are considering this approach to zoning. Where should the town be serious about minimizing new growth to preserve rural functions? And as you can think about those rural functions, those are natural functions, and they're on some of those maps hanging in the back of the room. Where should the town be thinking about building great neighborhoods that respect rural character? There's a lot of people that live in newer developments that have various degrees of rural character. Some have very high rural values and others are less about the rural character. But where should the town be thinking about neighborhood development that fits in with a rural context? And kind of the biggest question maybe, in addition to balancing some of those private property rights with community desires and needs, is are there places for rural uses like mineral extraction, like pig farms, chicken farms, sawmills? Are there places for these uses anywhere in Windham? And we've heard a lot of voices over the last year or so that say, that might be saying there's not. And I think that part of this discussion that the community is having and needs to have is, are there places for these types of uses in rural Windham? And if there are, we need to really think about how development, residential development, happens in those areas. And if not, we need to get more serious about thinking about how you build neighborhoods that fit in with a quiet country living lifestyle. I believe there's room for both of those kinds of things in Windham, but the question is where does that happen? Thank you very much for coming. I know it's a really nice evening, and we will be taking this information into account as we spend another couple months thinking about how to present this to the council so that they can have the next step in the conversation.